let's talk about everything that I read in January. Hello, my name is Emily Crow from The Cozy Crow, and welcome to my YouTube channel, and welcome to our first reading recap for the year 2025. January, it's been a doozy of a month. I've done a lot of escapism in reading and conquered a lot of really long books on audio this month. If you're new here, I like to talk about all things cozy, especially bookish things and yarny related topics. And today I'm going to share everything that I read in January. We'll start off with some statistics that I find really interesting to look back on, as well as addressing the goals that I set for this year and how I am doing in meeting those goals. And then we'll jump right into a book by book recap of what I read, a little synopsis about each book, and then what I rated it and who I would recommend that book for. And I do apologize, I am just slightly under the weather. I've had like a little mini cold this week. I'm getting better, but I might sound a little bit off, and I am taking frequent breaks to drink some water, help me get better faster. Let's talk about these statistics. So I read a total of 15 books this month. My rating on average was 4.05, so that sounds pretty good. I did have only one 5-star read this month, Chain Gang All Stars. I'm so excited to talk about that one. And my lowest rating this month was a 2.75 star rating. We'll talk about that one also. When looking at the breakdown of what format I read these books in, I read 13 books on audio. I read one book electronically, like on my Kindle, and then I read one book physically. Pretty on par with what I typically do. I read a lot of audiobooks, and then I may have a sprinkle of ebooks or physical books that I get through in a month. When we look at the genre that I read 11 fantasy books, also on par with the mood I've been in recently. I read 3 romances, and then I read 1 sci-fi. Not as widespread of genres compared to December, what I read, but also not super far off from my typical reading layout. A little bit different than last month, where I had a lot of random books of random genres that I was just getting through. I definitely focused on the fantasy this month. The longest book that I read in the month of January was A Court of Silver Flames, which is 751 pages. And I actually read 6 books over 500 pages long, which is wild. I read so many long books this month. I don't typically read that many long books, but I had some micro goals in mind and things that I was trying to read, and I was just having a lot of fun with the books that I was reading through. The shortest book that I read this month was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, and that is 194 pages. That was a nice and quick audiobook read. Also, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was the oldest book that I read. It was published in 1950 originally. And if we look at the breakdown of when the books I read were published, I read one book published this year in 2025. I'm sure you can guess which one that is. I read 5 books that were published in 2024, just last year. I read 6 books that were published in other 2020s years, so from 2020 to 2023. I read 1 book published in the 2000s, and then I read 2 books published in the 1950s. That was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then one of the other books in that series as well. I set a couple goals for myself in my reading this year, and I'll make sure to pop up the video where I talk about those goals up above and down below if you're interested in hearing more about that. I talked about it in my video where I shared my big reading stats for the year, as well as my top 24 books that I read in 2024. So there's a lot of really good stuff in that video. One of the goals that I set was to be more intentional about reading BIPOC authors, since I was surprised by how many I had read, but none of them had been an intentional choice for me last year. So I really wanted to intentionally choose BIPOC authors this year. And in doing so, I wanted to have at least one new to me BIPOC author chosen each month that I would read from. And this month, I actually read 3 books by BIPOC authors, and 2 of those authors were new to me. So that was really exciting, and I'll make sure to mention when I talk about their specific books. Another goal that I had was to intentionally choose to read some classics, and I read 2 classics. They were both middle grade classics, but I read 2 classics this month. And then my final goal was to read 25 books in my 2025 physical TBR, and I have a video where I walk you through my process of trying to select those books for my physical TBR shelves that are in my closet. So I'll pop that video up above and down below if you want to see my creative process and which books I decided to pick for that. I read 1 book from that list this month, so I currently have 1 out of 25 read. My goal is to read 2 a month, plus 1 month we'll have 3. Of course, I'm already behind, but I have lots of books in the works that I'm going to get to in February that I'm really excited about. The problem was I picked books I was in the mood to read in January, and then most of them were not available from my library yet, so I've had to wait a little bit for holds, but that's okay. I have all year to reach that goal. All right, now that we've talked about statistics, let's jump into each of these books that I read and what I rated them. The first book that I read was an audiobook. This was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and technically this is a reread for me. I read this a few times in my life, though it's been a really long time, and I don't actually own a copy. So I did the audiobook. This is by C.S. Lewis, if you are not familiar, but it's been around for a long time. C.S. Lewis is well known for writing like Christian fiction and even some Christian nonfiction too. And after reading The Wizard of Oz recently, I wanted to read other like middle grade classics like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And it was really interesting to kind of compare the two in their writing styles and the way I felt about them, because The Wizard of Oz like didn't give me as much as I was hoping for, but I really did enjoy The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I rated this a 4.5 star. This is a delightful story that was just fun to read. I really liked C.S. Lewis's voice. I also felt like there were some darker and more tense scenes as well. So there was like an interesting rhythm in like the emotionality of this book and in what I was reading. I felt like the plot and the world building was pretty linear, pretty straightforward in this book. But you could definitely tell this was intended to be an allegory for Jesus Christ. As an adult, I could clearly see that. I feel like it blew my mind when I was a child and I learned that that's what this was about. But I do feel like the themes and the intention of the author, regardless of the allegory of Jesus Christ, that the themes and morals included in the story are very accessible for kids and also very relatable for adults as well. And that made it a really well wrapped up story for me, if that makes sense. A problem I had with The Wizard of Oz was that the themes and lessons learned were kind of obscure for children. And if this is a children's book, I feel like children should be able to learn something if it has themes and morals written into it. I really liked this work by C.S. Lewis, and I feel like it kind of wrapped everything up in a bow. So I really, really enjoyed reading this. And I was thinking I might continue reading the series, though after reading one other in the series, I'm not quite sure if I want to do that anymore. The next book that I read was The Wedding Witch by Erin Sterling. I'm battling the time of day and some clouds outside, and this is not like the best lighting in my house. Anyway, The Wedding Witch by Erin Sterling. This is the third and final book in this series of witchy romances. I enjoyed the first book. I loved the second book, and I was really looking forward to this one for a long time. And it was all right. It just kind of let me down a little bit. I rated this a 3.5 star. I in general really liked these two main characters. It was Bowen, who is the third brother, and someone who's actually a human who's not a witch, who has been dealing in witchy artifacts. She's featured earlier on in the series. So it was really fun to see them go from like co-workers, acquaintances, to getting to know each other really well. They both end up at a witch's estate for this big wedding party. Something happens and they go back in time. That's honestly like half the book right there. I kind of have a problem with most of the plot being on the back of a book and you knowing exactly what's coming for like a really long time. What I didn't like as much for this book, it felt like the romance was kind of insta-lovey. I really loved their friendship, acquaintanceship, working with one another relationship, and it just went from that to like really spicy really, really quick. Like the time frame was really quick. We didn't get a lot of sexual tension. It felt very insta-lovey for me. I just wanted to see more of that growth, especially because this book was really short. It was like less than a 7-hour listen. It's less than 300 pages. Like it's a short romance. I would have loved more detail, kind of fleshing out the growth of this relationship. I also feel like the magic involved in this book, especially with time travel, it can get kind of muddy, and we just didn't get hardly any details. And so I feel like the author didn't try to unmuddy the time travel waters. You see all sorts of things happening as a result of them trying to fix the time travel and trying to figure out why did they go back in time and things like that. You know, a typical time travel book but the magic involved with both sending them back and fixing the situation and them coming back to their time was just really unclear, and it was very unsatisfying to read. I would love a little bit more detail about the magic related to this. I rated this a 3.5 star because I generally enjoy the writing style. I generally enjoyed the characters. I just wanted more details, and I feel like this book could have been 50 to 100 pages longer, and I would have liked it a lot more. It was just too short and didn't give me enough of what I wanted. The next book that I read was A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J. Maas, and I'm really excited that I'm done with the ACOTAR series. This was my least favorite of all of Sarah J. Maas's series. In this book, I rated it a 3.75 star. It was fine. I just am not really liking how ACOTAR is much more relationship focused. I want more fantasy in my romantasy generally. And so this series didn't fit me and my taste as well as other series of hers. So that's like a personal thing. I know some people love this series. I found that this book, first of all, it's about Nesta. She is so caustic, both for the first like half of this book as well as throughout the rest of the series, that it was like senselessly caustic, and it made me really angry. Set boundaries. You do not need to interact with a person who acts like that kind of thing. And so it was really frustrating to continue to read these characters, like trying to interact with her and trying to engage with her when she was just so caustic. And this book is about her personal growth. And while you learn a lot about her and you come to understand her, there's a lot of ways I really still don't agree with the choices that she made, and I'm still bothered by her, but you do see some personal growth for her. Nah, I didn't really like her as a character. It felt like her trauma was just an excuse to be cruel to those around her. That's me and Nesta. That's a me and Nesta issue. As far as this book goes, it is too freaking long. It's almost 800 pages, and because it was so much on Nesta's growth, it just felt way too long. And the plot was, I just wanted more plot. There are some magical objects that are brought in and their relationship to Nesta that was really interesting, and I wish that would have been fleshed out a little bit more. I also felt like the climax of the story, there was a couple different like climactic points towards the end of the book, but the one that was really the big climax that I feel like a lot of people who read this series would care about was resolved kind of a little bit too easily, in my opinion. And I feel like Sarah J. Maas does that a lot, where people are on the brink of death, or do you think someone died? And actually, psych, it's all okay. They got healed. And I need more death, destruction, turmoil that is like long lasting in my fantasies for my personal preference. So I enjoyed it, but I am also glad to be done with this series and moving on to something else. The next book that I read was a reread, and I put this book up here because I had not put this book on my bookshelf yet. This is Fourth Wing, but it's the paperback version. And so there's an extra bonus chapter in this version compared to other special editions. So I just hadn't gotten around to it. I wanted to reread Fourth Wing and then read that chapter just for more context. And I thought it would be the perfect time to reread Fourth Wing before Onyx Storm came out. So I read Fourth Wing and Iron Flame prior to Onyx Storm. So it's been a Rebecca Yarros kind of a month. And I rated this originally a 4.5 star. I didn't necessarily rate it this time, though I would rate it the same or maybe even slightly higher, like a 4.75 star. This is just such a fun fantasy that has a lot of intricacies in the world building and the lore and the magic that just make it really fun. It's not a super complicated fantasy that's hard to get into either. So it's definitely a different class than some of your traditional fantasies that you think of, like Tolkien. But I felt like I was reading a YA fantasy with some adult language and adult content, and it just made it a really fun, easy read that was really engaging and kept me hooked. And so I have had a lot of fun with this. And I've been also listening to Fantasy Fangirls podcast. I found them recently and listened to all their episodes about Fourth Wing and all their episodes about Iron Flame. And so now I'm all caught up so I can dive into all their episodes about Onyx Storm. And it's really fun to talk about theories and where this series is going, because it feels like there's a lot more behind everything that Rebecca Yarros is writing. And so like more and more details are coming out throughout the books, which has been a really fun experience to participate in. So I did reread Fourth Wing, I did the audiobook, and then I also read the bonus chapter. The next book that I read was actually Where the Library Hides by Isabel Ibañez. So this is one of my BIPOC books, though this was an author I read in, I think December is when I read the first book in this duology. It's a YA historical, slight fantasy, or like fiction with magical realism in it, I think I would say is more accurate, that takes place in, I think I looked it up, the 1880s in Egypt, when archaeology was all the rage and they were looking for Cleopatra's tomb and doing all that stuff, trying to find magical artifacts, etc., etc. This is the second in the duology, like I mentioned, and you are left on a horrible cliffhanger from the first book, and you go right into it in this book, and you see the horrible choices that these two young characters, Wit is like 21, 22, and Inez is, I think she's 17 to 19. I can't remember exactly her age. They're young, they are a little foolish, they make some choices that are also foolish, and you see kind of how that all plays out as they are navigating their relationship, as well as trying to find Inez's mother and some artifacts that have gone missing. I really liked how the plot is tied together between these two books. I was really invested in the first like 30% of this book as I was exploring Wit and Inez's relationship and how that was evolving. Wit especially made some really bad choices, and Inez forgave him way too quickly. And it was just kind of frustrating to read about how trusting she was. It could have been such a source of tension in their relationship. She was angry with him for a couple days and then she just had to move on. And then it wasn't really that big of a deal. Also, I rated this a 3.5 star. I liked the first book better. Some of the missing family member or new family member or coming back to life family member, those style tropes, they were in this book too. They were present not once in the first book, 2 or 3 times in the first book, also present 2 or 3 times in this book too, and it just got really old to keep getting family members revealed to the main characters and to the readers. So it just felt a little bit stale as far as like the plot devices that were used, if that makes sense. I also felt like, again, Inez couldn't trust anyone, but she kept trusting people. I do wish there was still more magic in this type of a series. I also wish there was more archaeology in this book specifically. It felt like there wasn't quite as much of the archaeological aspect in this book, but there was more magic in this book than the first book, and the magic made a little bit more sense as far as like, you know, cursing a tomb and things like that. I liked it. I would read more from this author. I just feel like they have a little bit more growth to do in story writing. This was not as much of a hit as I had hoped, but it wasn't bad. It was a 3.5 star, something I enjoyed, but had some big flaws. The next book that I finished was my only physical book that I finished in the month, and this is Holiday Romance by Catherine Walsh, and I really adored this book. I thought it might be a 5 star, but I kind of took a break from it for a couple weeks because I just didn't feel like picking it up, and that kind of tells me that it wasn't actually a 5 star. I rated it a 4.5 star. It just got a little bit slow and not enough tension to keep the story moving forward, if that makes sense. It is a friends to lovers where you see Molly and Andrew trying to make it home to Ireland from Chicago during Christmas time. Flights have been canceled. They have to go on this like wacky trip. Lots of travel anxiety. It was really fun to read about their efforts to try to get home for Christmas. And you also get flashbacks to every single flight they've taken the past 10 years together to get home for Christmas, where they first meet and there's some awkward encounters, and then they start to actually become friends and get to know each other. You see that friendship grow a lot, which I really, really loved. I just didn't feel enough sexual tension building up or evidenced in this relationship between these characters. It just would have been so much sweeter to know how much Molly cared about Andrew, that she would have considered dating him earlier on. I don't know, it felt like it caught her off guard, and then she was thrown off because she's like, wait, how have I never felt this way before? Like, am I just exhausted from all this travel? And it just wasn't like a perfect fit for me as far as like the tension in the friends to lovers relationship. though I really loved seeing their relationship blossom as they both acknowledged their feelings and started exploring them and starting like the dating process. I really did love that. And this was such a sweet and wholesome type of romance story, and you got to see how they interacted with each of their families. This book felt really realistic in a lot of ways, but because of that, I feel like it felt a little bit tensionless compared to what I would have liked. And I don't like an unrealistic romance, but I just feel like a little bit more intensity would have been nice to kind of keep the story moving forward. And the conflict was really reasonable between these characters at the end. But I also felt like the conflict resolved with just some personal decisions that the characters made, and they just like moved on, and they're like, you know what, I'm gonna be okay with this, instead of having a little bit more build up. The pacing could have been a little bit different in regards to the conflict, and I feel like I would have enjoyed the story even a little bit more. But I really love these characters. They are flawed, but also are a really good fit together, and you still really love them and root for them. But yeah, some of the balancing with the friends to lovers and the tension in the story was like not perfect for me, but I still really loved this book, and I'm excited to read more from this author. The next book that I read was The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis, and I did this on audiobook as well, and I only rated this a 3.5 star. Maybe I'll drop it to 3.25 star. Like I said, I was thinking about continuing on this series, reading lots of really quick books and kind of just binging the whole series. I've read them all before, long ago, and this book made me stop a little bit because it was fine, but it was just fine. The heavy-handedness of the allegory of like the creation story was very unoriginal and kind of boring because it is a story that we all know. Even people who are not avid Christians are very familiar because of the way that our Western society has formed, right? And it just felt a little bit boring to read about. There wasn't a lot of expansion on concepts. The story of the two little kids that were traveling between worlds was not as interesting or as exciting as I had hoped. It was just like fine. It was just a fine book, so that's why it's a 3.5 star. There's nothing hugely wrong with it, but I just don't know if I want to continue reading in this series, if the pacing will be different, if the inspiration behind these stories is gonna feel more subtle and more nuanced, which might be more interesting. Again, I'm not the target audience because they are middle grade books. The next book that I read was Iron Flame by Rebecca Yarros. And again, I didn't really rate this book on my second read, but the first time I rated it a 4.25 star, and I would keep my rating the same, maybe even bump it up just a smidgen. I have really loved diving back into this world and seeing the connections between these two books. I hadn't reread Fourth Wing prior to Iron Flame, and so it gave me a different perspective to reread these books back to back, and also thinking about the allusions and foreshadowing that the author is doing and where this series is going. There's just so much open about what is going to happen with the series, especially in a 5-book series. There's a lot of unanswered questions that are really intriguing, and so it's just really fun to think about theories and to prep for Onyx's Storm. The next book that I read was Stranger Skies by Pascale Lacelle, and this is the second book in the Curious Tides trilogy now. It was going to be a duology, but when the author was writing this book, they realized that it should be a trilogy, and I do agree with that, though I do feel like this book could have been a little bit shorter, but I did see where the story was going and how it needed to end where it did, lead to a third book that is coming who knows when, which is a little frustrating. Like, I want to read a finished series, but that book will come. I rated this a 4.25 star. I liked Curious Tides just a little bit more, though this book had me hooked from the beginning. Like, the first half of the story, I plowed through. I was gobbling it all up. I really was intrigued at where these characters were going and how they were going to deal with the aftermath of book 1, and so that was really fascinating. I do feel like, in general, this magic system is a little bit convoluted and sometimes hard to follow what's going on, especially beyond what their regular magic is, but like how eclipse spore magic works and they're traveling between worlds that is happening and things like that. It's just a little bit hard to follow. I do wish there was a little bit more depth to these characters in this book, that those side characters had been fleshed out just a little bit more as we got to know them a little bit better in this book. But it, again, ended on a really big cliffhanger that leaves a lot of open questions about where the story is going for the last book. And so that's a really fun place to end this book on, to really not know what to expect for the next book. So I'm very intrigued. I have no idea when the third book is coming out, because this recently came out just a few months ago in 2024. And then my 2025 release that I've read, Onyx Storm by Rebecca Yarros, and I lucked out because my library got 1,000 copies of the audiobook, and I was like person 300 in line. So I got to start reading this book at like 10:30 at night the day before it released. So that was just super fun. And I was staying up for a midnight release party at a local bookstore, Poppy's, that's in Spanish Fork, Utah. So I got to listen to a bunch of this book even before that party and then on my drive home from the party. So I got a really good head start on this. I did get the deluxe edition. I had a lot of fun. I enjoyed this book more than Iron Flame. I'm rating it a 4.5 star, and I know lots of people are really trying hard to avoid spoilers. I will say that while I feel like a lot of what happened in this book is predictable, it's predictable with big twists to it that were unexpected that caught me off guard. And so it made it still a really fun reading experience. I did feel like the things that Violet was doing in multiple points in this book were hidden from the reader, which was a little bit different than in Rebecca Yarros' other books. And that made it kind of hard to know what was going on when Violet wasn't disclosing to the reader what was happening for a couple chapters at a time. And so that was a different choice by Rebecca Yarros, not one I'm super fond of, though it definitely showed how clever Violet was. Also, the ending of this wrecked me. Again, I have no idea where the next piece of the story is gonna go, but my prediction is that with these 5 books, is that book 4 is gonna be my favorite, is my guess. Because usually the lead up into the climax in series is my favorite, and then usually the climax is not quite the right balance for me and what I like in a series. So I'm gonna call it, I think book 4 is gonna be my favorite in this series, but this one is tied with Fourth Wing currently for my favorite. Another one with fun end pages. This is The 13th Child by Erin A. Craig, and this is my first book by her. I know she's written a few other stories. This is a duology, House of Salt and Sorrows maybe. She's written YA, and I was really excited to get to know her writing style. And in general, I really enjoyed this book. I rated it a 4.25 star. This story follows Hazel, who is, I guess, claimed by the god of death to be his apprentice, because she is the 13th child in a family. So I don't know what the significance of that is, but they're very uncommon. She's been claimed by the god of death, and she's trained by him to be a healer, but also to end people's suffering when they are slated for death, if that makes sense. And so she's still really young in this book. She's like 19 years old. You see her make a couple choices that are the same, poor choices. Even though there were consequences the first time she makes that choice, she does it again. And that's like the bulk of this story is the result of those poor choices that she's made and how she tries to fix them and make things better, and seeing the unintended consequences of her actions, because she has a really hard time wrestling with the idea of putting people out of their misery when they are slated for death and letting them pass comfortably. I'm a nurse, and so I have feelings about that. That was not the kind of conflict that I have personally. I've seen a lot of suffering. I think that people deserve to die with dignity instead of us trying super, super hard to just keep their bodies alive for the sake of keeping their bodies alive. And I could talk way more about that, but her internal struggle was not one that I've felt. I really loved her powers, not just like her healing magic that she could do, but also the study that she put into learning about healing, so that with or without her powers, she had a lot of tools in her arsenal to heal people. She became very well known and had access to the king's palace at one point in time. There was like a mysterious curse going on she was trying to fix. So it was a very fascinating story. Had some gothic vibes, but was not an entirely gothic fairy tale type of a story. Was a little bit less in your face of a gothic fairy tale vibe than other gothic fairy tales. And so I like that because that fit the mood that I was in. And I really loved this premise of the story. I just again, got kind of frustrated with Hazel and her choices and her lack of understanding consequences. I also felt like the romance in here was kind of weak. There was just a couple interactions between these characters, and then all of a sudden they really, really cared about each other and were like committed, and it was just kind of shallow. I just didn't see the jump from actually I don't hate you to I would die for you kind of mentality. I wish I could have gotten more of that on page, especially considering how long this book is. This is a longer length book, but I like that this is a standalone, and I will definitely be reading more from this author. After so many fantasies, I needed a break, so I picked up Icebreaker as a fluffy rom-com. This is by Hannah Grace. It's about a figure skater and an ice hockey skater who have to share the rink because one of their rinks at their college has been tampered with and needs repairs, and so they end up interacting a little bit more because of that forced proximity. There's definitely some chemistry between them and some sexual tension. This book is kind of navigating that year of college that they are experiencing, both with like their games and events that they are attending, their trainings, their personal relationships. You get a bit of college life and things. And so it was a different pacing than I was expecting. It is a little bit longer of a romance book, but it was definitely the fluffy romance that I was looking for. Like I said, set in the college setting. These two are kind of horny. It has a lot of spicy scenes, but nothing super like crazy out there as far as spice goes. I felt like Anastasia, her character was really mature emotionally in a lot of ways, but in other ways really not. It was kind of weird to see her flip-flop so much. And as far as Nate's character, he was a little bit bland. Like I feel like he was portrayed as the perfect book boyfriend, but he didn't have any distinguishing features, if that makes sense. It was good. I would read more from this author, but nothing super compelling for me other than it was just fun and easy, and if I want to read another book like this, I know exactly where to go because she's got 2 other books related to these characters in an interconnected standalone that I know I can look forward to. And it was just so frustrating. Like, her relationship with her skating partner was super, super toxic, mostly because of him. And she just kept going along with it because she would say, he's manipulative, but he still cares about me. Or he's being really toxic, but we're partners, so we're in this together. And it was just really frustrating that was like the constant conversation throughout this whole book until finally he did something that was the last straw. So you knew it was coming the whole time that eventually they would not work together. Also, the epilogue was way far of a stretch, and I won't spoil it, but it just like didn't make sense. It was like too good of an ending. It would have been way more believable if it had been written slightly different. But that's just me. There's some flaws, but it was in general a good time. My favorite book of the month, as well as one of my new to me BIPOC authors. This is Chain Gang All-Stars, which is by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. And I tried to find the pronunciation online, but I couldn't necessarily find it. So I do apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. It's gotten lots of awards, you can see. It is a sci-fi set in a dystopian world that is honestly not too far in the future, where prisoners are given the option to join this like fighting ring. And if they win every fight they have, that's like dozens of fights, right? And survive 3 years in this fight ring, then they can leave and have like all charges removed from their record and like be reintegrated into society. This book is a social commentary on the justice system in the United States and on police reform. It was wild, honestly. I knew we had a corrupt system, but seeing how it's not that far of a stretch to go from what we have now to this, and also the author includes actual statistics from nowadays, like from the late 2010s, about different demographics that have a higher risk of being incarcerated, or different demographics that have a higher risk of dying in prisons, or different demographics that are more likely to be hurt physically in the prison system, or to have shows of force used on them, kind of thing. Like, fascinating stuff. Also, the fact that tear gas is internationally illegal, it's considered a war crime, and yet we use it. Like, the police here in the US use it for crowds. Wild stuff. And so some of that was definitely on my radar, but seeing it in black and white and seeing it in relation to this dystopian world was really impactful for me. And seeing the humanity of these characters that are not likable in a way that you appreciate them as a person and you like their personality, or you can understand why they made the choices they did. They are likable in the fact that you can really see their humanity and how the literal torture that they are going through is not right, that they've felt they had to choose this option as a way to get out of the system, because this is unfortunately better than the other options that are out there. I feel like everyone needs to read this book. I feel like this is a huge commentary on our society nowadays. And why is it always about US? Handmaid's Tale, US. Chain Gang All-Stars, totally about the US. We've got a lot of issues here, and I feel like this book is for sure set to be a modern day classic. I am almost tempted to reread again because I had such an experience reading it the first time that I need to revisit that because of what it did for my soul, if that makes sense. Highly recommend for everybody to read that. Whether or not you are from the US, whether or not you have issues with the justice system as it stands nowadays, you should read this. The next book that I read was the second book in the Mistborn series. This is The Well of Ascension. And this is part of like their original trilogy. And then I know there's another 4 books after this that are like a separate storyline, I guess. I don't know. But I had been reading this on audio and my hold ran out and I had like 8 hours left of my audiobook. But it magically came in 3 days ago. And so I've just binged the last of it because I had been waiting to get to the end of this. And I am really bad at reading physical books. I read them way slower than I get through audiobooks. And so I had not made a lot of progress in this. I was so excited to get the audiobook back because it's on hold for forever from my library. And I lucked out. While I love Mistborn, I really enjoyed this one and I rated it a 4.5 star. There were some ways it wasn't my favorite compared to the first book in the series. This book is definitely more focused on Vin and Ellen's relationship and the turmoil as they are coming to terms with their new roles in this new empire and how they are combating the struggles outside of them and how that's impacting their relationship. So very interesting. I loved the character development there, but it definitely felt a little bit slower because it focused so much on that development. Also, they were kind of waiting for a siege to happen on their city. And so there was a lot of waiting around and politics and political intrigue and trying to figure out how they were going to navigate this without everybody dying. Again, very fascinating and very well written. It just slowed the story down a lot because they were doing a lot of waiting and talking and considering their personal relationships and doing some more waiting and talking. And so the story and plot didn't move along super fast because of that. Definitely a slower pace. I did really like how the last 200 pages are so much action, lots happening as things were starting to move. You learn a lot about what's going on, but there's also a lot of questions. And this cliffhanger really leads into the next book where I don't know how it's all going to resolve and what's going to happen. Again, you get some tragedy, you get some death and some turmoil that happens with all of these characters in general. And so I feel like there's a really good balance in the story. This one, again, a little bit slower than the first one, but I still thoroughly enjoyed it and cannot wait to get to the third book. And then the last book that I read was not my favorite. In fact, it was my least favorite of the month, and that made me kind of sad because this is House of Frank by Synclaire, another BIPOC author that I didn't realize was BIPOC until I was looking into it. So I was really happy to be able to support her. This was published through Easy Cat Press. I really love Jason's presence online and the way he's built his platform and how he is promoting other voices that need to be heard. I just wanted to support them all. I just wanted to support them. So I bought this book. It was the only one at my Barnes & Noble, and I finally got the ebook from my library and was reading through it. Of course, I had 100 pages left when my ebook hold ran out, and so I had to read the rest physically, but I was able to get it done before the end of the month. I rated this a 2.75 star. I could see how some people might love this book and rate it a 5 star, but it was not the book for me. It was very grief focused, and it was a very different experience of grief than one that I identify with. It was all consuming, all encompassing, even though the death of her sister was a couple years in the past, and even though she knew the death was coming for a few years, like she was just still so overwhelmed by that grief that she was not really functioning. And that was really hard for me to relate to and to understand. And honestly, I didn't like this main character. She was very unlikable for me. I had a hard time sympathizing with her. I feel like she made a lot of choices that were not thoughtful for the others that she interacted with at the Arboretum. I just got frustrated over and over again by, the choices she was making, the way she was using her time, her talents, her efforts, and I just really didn't understand her, like, throughout the whole thing. And I feel like for some people, they might really connect with that portrayal of grief, but for me, I just really didn't feel it. I also feel like all the side characters were really fun to get to know. They were all really distinct and interesting, and then we just didn't get a lot of backstory about any of them. It was very minimal, and any backstory we did get was pretty like overarching, like, oh yeah, everyone here has lost someone. And then you get like 1 or 2 more sentences later on in the book about like who they lost and when they lost them, and that was all you heard. And I just would have loved a lot more detail about these characters and their backstories and how they all fit together, how they ended up at Ash Gardens and their experiences that led them there. I just wanted more about the backstories. I feel like the grief aspect of the story overpowered everything else, including the plot and the side characters, and I didn't really like that balance. I wanted more details about the magic in this world because it is a fantasy. There's all sorts of really interesting creatures. There's magic involved, and we just didn't get a lot of details about that. In a lot of ways, it just didn't live up to what I was hoping for from a cozy fantasy story with some grief elements. The balance was not what I wanted. So again, I feel like someone else might really love this story and it might really speak to them, but for me, it did not. All right, there we have it. Those are the 15 books that I read in January. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts are, because I would love to hear. Make sure if you really like my content and want to see more from me that you subscribe and hit the bell notification so you can be notified every time I post a new video. And let me know down below what your favorite read was from January so I can get some really good recommendations from you. You saw lots of fantasy, little romance, a little smidge of sci-fi, but I honestly read a little bit of everything, though fantasy and romance are definitely the categories I read more in. But I would love to hear what books you are loving right now. And until next time, happy reading. Bye!
Waking up, it's gone. It leaves us feeling cold again.